There is a profound, almost Shakespearean tragedy in the architecture of European history. For decades, the continent that birthed the modern concept of total war believed it had finally escaped the gravitational pull of its own violent past. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not merely a geopolitical triumph, it was heralded as the definitive end of history, the final victory of liberal democracy and perpetual peace. We dismantled the watchtowers, melted down the tank treads into plowshares, and convinced ourselves that the spectre of industrial-scale slaughter had been banished forever. Yet history is not a linear march towards enlightenment, it is a relentless, cyclical wheel. Today, as artillery shells once again crater the fertile soil of Eastern Europe, the grand illusion of a demilitarized utopia has shattered. Europe is scrambling to rearm, desperately trying to restart the dormant forges of its military-industrial complex. How did we arrive back at this precipice? How did a continent so deeply scarred by the cataclysms of the 20th century forget the fundamental maxim of antiquity, si vis pacem para bellum, if you want peace, prepare for war? As a historian, observing this frantic return to the arsenals of the past feels less like a strategic awakening and more like the tragic, inevitable unraveling of a beautiful, decades-long dream. To understand the depth of our current predicament, we must return to the euphoria of the early 1990s. The collapse of the Soviet Union sent a shockwave of profound relief across a continent that had spent nearly half a century holding its breath. The intricate, terrifying machinery of the Cold War, the nuclear tripwires, the massive standing armies stationed along the inner German border, the constant, suffocating dread of Armageddon was suddenly obsolete. Governments across Western Europe eagerly seized upon what became known as the peace dividend. The logic was seductively simple. Without a monolithic existential threat looming to the east, the astronomical sums previously poured into defense budgets could be redirected towards social welfare, infrastructure, and economic integration. The vast arsenals that had defined the NATO alliance were viewed no longer as necessary shields, but as expensive, rusting relics of a bygone era of paranoia. We began to decommission warships, close, sprawling military bases, and drastically reduce the size of our armed forces. The prevailing intellectual consensus dictated that economic interdependence and the soft power of the European Union had rendered conventional warfare obsolete on the continent. We were building a post-historical paradise, blind to the structural rot taking hold within our defensive capabilities. This deliberate dismantling of military infrastructure was thorough and systematic. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, European nations engaged in a process of strategic disarmament that, in hindsight, borders on the reckless. Defense spending plummeted well below the NATO target of 2% of gross domestic product. The military-industrial complex, once a roaring engine of technological innovation and mass production, was forced to radically downsize. Factories that had churned out thousands of main battle tanks and millions of artillery shells were either shuttered or repurposed for civilian manufacturing. Supply chains for critical military components withered away, and the highly specialized workforce of engineers and armorers slowly dispersed. Europe effectively outsourced its ultimate security guarantees to the United States, resting comfortably beneath the American nuclear umbrella while focusing entirely on expeditionary, low-intensity conflicts. The armies of Europe transformed into boutique forces, highly trained perhaps, but lacking the logistical depth, the ammunition reserves, and the heavy armor required to fight a protracted, high-intensity conventional war. We traded the broadsword for the scalpel, entirely forgetting that the ghosts of our past were forged in the brutal, grinding attrition of trench and artillery warfare. The prevailing philosophy of this era was deeply rooted in a uniquely European form of hubris. Policymakers in Brussels, London, Paris, and Berlin convinced themselves that the very nature of power had fundamentally shifted. Hard power, the crude calculus of divisions, fighter squadrons, and artillery batteries, was viewed as an archaic concept, a relic of the 20th century that sophisticated, modern democracies had outgrown. Instead, the continent championed soft power, believing that the magnetic appeal of democratic values, free markets, and diplomatic dialogue could tame any rogue state or resurgent empire. Economic entanglement, particularly with energy suppliers to the east, was actively pursued not just for profit, but as a deliberate strategy for peace. The theory was that nations bound together by pipelines and trade agreements would never risk the catastrophic economic self-destruction of war. This was the era of Wandel, Durch, Handel, change through trade. It was a beautiful, deeply civilized concept, but it was built upon a fatal misunderstanding of history. It assumed that all international actors shared the same rational economic priorities, ignoring the dark, atavistic forces of nationalism, historical grievance, and imperial ambition that have always driven human conflict. To comprehend the sheer scale of this strategic amnesia, one must look at the physical scars still etched into the European landscape. Beneath the tranquil fields of Flanders and the dense forests of the Ardennes lie the shattered remnants of the First and Second World Wars. These conflicts were not won by soft power or diplomatic finesse. They were decided by the brutal, unrelenting logic of industrial capacity. The Somme, Verdun, Stalingrad, and Normandy, these names are synonymous with the colossal expenditure of blood and materiel. During the height of the Second World War, the factories of the belligerent nations operated around the clock, churning out millions of tons of munitions, thousands of aircraft, and endless columns of armor. The survival of nations depended entirely on the resilience of their supply chains and the sheer volume of their heavy industry. Yet, by the dawn of the 21st century, Europe had entirely divorced itself from this grim reality. We treated the monuments to the fallen as solemn reminders of a barbarism we had permanently evolved beyond, rather than stark warnings of the inherent fragility of peace. The historical memory of total war faded from a lived, visceral experience into abstract textbook chapters. Even during the tense decades of the Cold War, the spectre of industrial warfare remained sharply in focus. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was not merely a political alliance, it was a massive, heavily armed garrison designed to halt a Soviet armored juggernaut pushing through the Fulda Gap. West Germany alone maintained a standing army of 500,000 men, backed by thousands of Leopard tanks and a deeply entrenched network of bunkers and defensive lines. Every bridge was pre-wired with explosives. Every highway was designed to double as an emergency airstrip. The defense industry was a vital, heavily subsidized pillar of the national economy. Governments understood that credible deterrence required not just nuclear weapons, but the visible, tangible capacity to wage conventional war on an apocalyptic scale. The arsenals were constantly replenished, and the logistical frameworks for mass mobilization were rigorously tested. This was a Europe that, while deeply desiring peace, lived in a constant, disciplined state of readiness. The contrast between the muscular, heavily armored posture of the 1980s and the hollowed-out, skeletal military structures of the 2000s is a testament to how rapidly geopolitical realities and illusions can shift. Throughout the 1990s, the intellectual climate across European capitals was defined by an overwhelming sense of historical finality. The collapse of the Soviet Empire was interpreted not merely as a strategic victory, but as a permanent ideological triumph. This led to a profound stagnation in military strategic thinking. The defense establishments of Europe, previously highly respected institutions, were increasingly viewed as bureaucratic dinosaurs, draining resources from the newly integrated, prosperous European project. We witnessed the rapid decommissioning of heavy armored divisions, the scrapping of thousands of combat aircraft, and the deliberate shrinking of naval fleets. The intricate logistical networks designed to move massive armies across the continent were dismantled or sold off to private logistics firms. The political leadership became entirely fixated on the expansion of the European Union and the integration of former Warsaw Pact nations into the free market, assuming that shared economic prosperity would automatically guarantee perpetual security. This era of stagnation was a period of willful blindness, a collective refusal to acknowledge that the fundamental nature of geopolitics, the brutal competition for power and security, had not been abolished by the fall of a single wall. The rot within the arsenals was not an accident, it was a deliberate policy choice. As the new millennium dawned, the focus of European militaries shifted entirely away from the defense of the continent towards expeditionary, asymmetric warfare. The interventions in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and the Middle East dictated a radical restructuring of armed forces. The demand was no longer for massive armored columns capable of holding a static front line against a peer adversary, but for light, highly mobile, and technologically advanced units designed for counterinsurgency and peacekeeping operations. We invested heavily in mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles, precision-guided munitions for surgical strikes, and advanced special operations capabilities. While these transformations were necessary for the conflicts of the time, they came at the direct expense of conventional warfare capabilities. The capacity to conduct large-scale, combined arms maneuvers withered, artillery regiments were disbanded, air defense systems were mothballed, deemed unnecessary against insurgents lacking air forces. Europe effectively built highly capable boutique counterterrorism forces, entirely forgetting that the primary purpose of a national military is the deterrence of existential threats from hostile state actors. We optimized our militaries for the wars of choice, leaving ourselves catastrophically vulnerable to the wars of absolute necessity. This strategic pivot was accompanied by a relentless systemic underfunding of the defense apparatus. The NATO benchmark, requiring member states to commit 2% of their gross domestic product to military expenditure, was widely treated as a polite suggestion rather than a binding obligation. Year after year, finance ministries across Western Europe slashed defense budgets to balance domestic ledgers. The consequences of this fiscal starvation were profound and deeply damaging. Equipment maintenance schedules were routinely deferred, leading to shockingly low readiness rates across air forces and armored brigades. Procurement programs for essential next-generation platforms were endlessly delayed, scaled back, or cancelled altogether due to lack of capital. The defense industry, starved of domestic orders, was forced to consolidate heavily and rely almost exclusively on volatile export markets to survive. The European shield was not just rusting, it was actively crumbling from within. Military commanders were forced to cannibalize parts from functioning vehicles just to keep a fraction of their fleets operational. This was a period of profound strategic negligence, where the illusion of safety allowed politicians to treat the military not as the ultimate insurance policy of the state, but as a convenient piggy bank to be raided for short-term political gain. Perhaps the most dangerous consequence of this systemic underfunding was Europe's total, uncritical reliance on the security guarantees provided by the United States. The American military umbrella allowed European nations to indulge in the luxury of post-historical pacifism without bearing the actual costs of deterrence. The United States maintained the massive strategic airlift capabilities, the vast intelligence and reconnaissance networks, and the overwhelming conventional and nuclear firepower that underpinned the entire NATO alliance. Europe effectively outsourced its geopolitical survival across the Atlantic. This dependency fostered a deeply ingrained strategic lethargy. European leaders grew comfortable delivering grand diplomatic pronouncements on the world stage, knowing full well that the hard power required to back them up was stationed in Washington, not Brussels. However, this transatlantic bargain was always inherently fragile. It assumed that American strategic priorities would remain eternally aligned with European interests and that the American taxpayer would indefinitely subsidize the defense of a wealthy, technologically advanced continent. The failure to build a sovereign, capable European pillar within NATO was a catastrophic strategic error, leaving the continent uniquely vulnerable to shifts in American domestic politics and the inevitable pivot of Washington's strategic focus towards the Indo-Pacific theater. History rarely turns without warning. It usually provides tremors before the earthquake. The first significant tremor to strike the post-Cold War illusion occurred in August 2008 in the rugged terrain of the Caucasus. The brief, intense conflict in Georgia was a stark, brutal demonstration of resurgent Russian military power and political will. It was the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union that Moscow had utilized conventional military force to directly intervene in a neighboring sovereign state, effectively redrawing international borders by force. For a fleeting moment, the alarm bells rang across European intelligence agencies. The conflict demonstrated a clear willingness to employ hard power to achieve strategic objectives, shattering the assumption that economic integration alone could pacify the region. Yet, the European political response was characterized by a profound, almost desperate desire to avoid confrontation. Following a brief period of diplomatic condemnation, relations rapidly normalized. The desire to maintain lucrative energy contracts and the belief that this was merely an isolated, localized dispute over breakaway republics overpowered any strategic awakening. Europe chose to hit the snooze button on history, willfully ignoring the glaring warning that the era of state-on-state kinetic warfare had not in fact been relegated to the past. If Georgia was a tremor, The events of 2014 were a massive geopolitical earthquake. The illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and the instigation of an armed insurgency in the Donbass region fundamentally altered the security architecture of the continent. This was not a border skirmish. It was the blatant, forcible seizure of sovereign European territory, executed with a chilling combination of covert operations, cyber warfare, and conventional military intimidation. The sight of heavily armed soldiers without insignia seizing strategic infrastructure was a masterclass in hybrid warfare that left European capitals paralyzed. The subsequent downing of a civilian airliner over eastern Ukraine should have been the final undeniable catalyst for a massive European rearmament. It exposed the sheer lethality and recklessness of the forces unleashed on the continent's eastern frontier. NATO did respond, implementing the Readiness Action Plan and deploying enhanced forward presence battle groups to the Baltic states and Poland. However, this response, while symbolically important, was structurally inadequate. It was a tripwire, not a shield. The fundamental systemic underinvestment in European military capacity continued largely unabated, driven by a stubborn refusal to accept the grim reality of the new strategic environment. The period between 2014 and 2022 will be judged harshly by future historians as an era of catastrophic strategic denial. Despite the ongoing grinding trench warfare in eastern Ukraine, despite the escalating cyber attacks on critical European infrastructure, and despite the increasingly belligerent rhetoric emanating from the East, the core of Western Europe clung desperately to the dying embers of the peace dividend. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, a massive energy infrastructure initiative that deepened European dependence on Russian gas, was pushed forward despite furious objections from Eastern European allies and the United States. This project epitomized the profound disconnect between economic policy and strategic security. The prevailing belief remained that economic entanglement was the ultimate safeguard against total war. Defense budgets saw only marginal, agonizingly slow increases, barely keeping pace with inflation. The structural deficits in ammunition, stockpiles, heavy armor, and air defense capabilities were acknowledged in closed-door intelligence briefings, but ignored in public budgetary debates. The continent was sleepwalking towards a precipice, mesmerized by the illusion of its own sophisticated diplomacy, entirely failing to recognize that the fundamental calculus of power on the continent had already violently shifted. The tragic climax of this decades-long strategic slumber arrived with deafening brutality in the early hours of February 24th, 2022. The invasion of Ukraine shattered every remaining illusion about the nature of security in the 21st century. This was not a limited hybrid operation. It was a massive multi-axis conventional assault involving thousands of tanks, relentless ballistic missile barrages, and the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of troops. The sheer scale and savagery of the conflict brought the horrors of the Second World War crashing back into the high-definition reality of modern Europe. Cities were reduced to rubble by indiscriminate artillery fire, millions of refugees flooded across borders, and the spectre of nuclear escalation returned to the daily news cycle. The shockwave that hit European capitals was absolute. The intricate theories of soft power, economic interdependence, and post-historical peace evaporated in the span of a single morning. Europe was forced to confront the terrifying reality that it possessed neither the military hardware nor the industrial capacity to sustain a prolonged, high-intensity conflict on its own continent. The rusting, hollowed-out shield of the European military apparatus was suddenly exposed to the searing heat of total war, sparking a frantic, desperate scramble for survival. The immediate aftermath of the invasion triggered a profound, almost visceral shock doctrine across the European political landscape. Long-standing geopolitical taboos were shattered overnight. Nations that had stubbornly clung to absolute neutrality for decades, such as Sweden and Finland, fundamentally reassessed their national security paradigms and urgently petitioned for NATO membership, radically redrawing the strategic map of the Baltic Sea. The European Union, an institution explicitly founded as a peace project designed to make war materially impossible, took the unprecedented step of financing the purchase and delivery of lethal weaponry to a third country under active attack. This was a Rubicon moment, a fundamental transformation of the bloc's core identity from an economic community to a geopolitical actor capable of wielding hard power. The psychological impact on the European populace was equally seismic. The abstract concept of war, long relegated to distant deserts and mountains, was suddenly a visceral, immediate threat right on their doorstep. The realization that freedom and democracy are not natural, immutable states of being, but fragile constructs that must be actively, aggressively defended with steel and explosives, struck the continent with the force of a physical blow. The era of comfortable complacency was violently terminated. Nowhere was this shock more profound or the historical reversal more dramatic than in Germany. For decades, the economic engine of Europe had cultivated a deeply ingrained culture of pacifism, driven by the profound guilt and historical burden of the Second World War. Its military, the Bundeswehr, had been chronically underfunded, plagued by equipment shortages, and restricted by strict rules of engagement. Yet, within days of the conflict erupting, the German Chancellor announced the Zeitenwende, a historical turning point. It was an astonishing paradigm shift. The immediate commitment of a massive special fund of 100 billion euros to revitalize the armed forces marked the definitive end of German military reluctance. This was not merely a policy adjustment, it was the painful tearing up of a deeply held national identity. The psychological barrier against rearmament, built meticulously over 70 years, was dismantled overnight. Germany, along with the rest of Europe, was finally acknowledging the grim reality that the historian always knew. The preservation of peace requires the tangible, undeniable capacity to inflict unacceptable damage upon an aggressor. The era of the peace dividend was officially declared dead, and the frantic race to rebuild the arsenals began. However, declaring a massive increase in defense spending is profoundly different from actually producing military hardware. The immediate crisis that gripped Europe was not a lack of political will, but a catastrophic lack of industrial capacity, most acutely visible in the critical shortage of artillery ammunition. Modern, high-intensity warfare consumes munitions at a rate that is simply staggering to the modern European mind. The daily expenditure of artillery shells on the Eastern Front quickly outstripped the entire monthly production capacity of the European defense industry. Stockpiles that were supposed to last for months of sustained combat were depleted in a matter of weeks. The reality of Europe's hollowed-out industrial base became terrifyingly clear. We had the money, but we did not have the factories, the machine tools, the raw materials, or the skilled labor required to forge the tools of war. Producing a modern 155mm artillery shell requires a complex supply chain involving specialized steel, highly volatile explosives, and precision electronics. Decades of consolidation and neglect meant that there were only a handful of facilities left in Europe capable of this production. The continent found itself entirely dependent on a fragile, severely bottlenecked supply chain. As the political mandates for rearmament were issued, the European defense industry slammed immediately into the brutal reality of fractured, globalized supply chains. Decades of prioritizing cost efficiency over strategic resilience had left the continent dangerously exposed. The production of modern military hardware is not a localized endeavor. It is deeply reliant on a complex web of international suppliers. The sudden exponential surge in demand revealed catastrophic bottlenecks. Critical components, such as advanced microchips required for precision-guided munitions, optical sensors for targeting pods, and even the specialized machine tools necessary for forging artillery barrels, were subject to massive delays. More alarmingly, Europe discovered its severe dependency on foreign adversaries for the raw materials of war. The rare earth elements essential for aerospace electronics, and even the basic nitrocellulose required for artillery propellants, were largely sourced from outside the continent, often from nations with competing geopolitical interests. The realization dawned that a sovereign defense capability requires not just factories, but entire, secure logistical ecosystems. European governments are now engaged in a frantic, incredibly costly effort to reshore critical manufacturing and secure independent supply lines, a painful reversal of the globalization that defined the post-Cold War era. The immense challenge now facing Europe is the Herculean task of waking this sleeping industrial giant. The defense sector, accustomed for decades to producing small batches of highly sophisticated, bespoke equipment for niche expeditionary forces, is being violently forced to pivot back to mass production. This transition is fraught with friction. You cannot simply flip a switch and instantly generate a fully functioning military-industrial complex. Building new production lines for munitions, armored vehicles, and air defense interceptors requires years of capital investment, rigorous safety certifications, and the painstaking reconstruction of lost expertise. Furthermore, the global supply chains for critical raw materials such as nitrocellulose for propellants, titanium for aerospace components, and rare earth elements for advanced electronics are heavily constrained and often controlled by geopolitical rivals. European nations are now frantically signing long-term procurement contracts, trying to provide the defense industry with the financial predictability required to justify massive capital investments. It is a desperate race against time, a scramble to rebuild in months what was systematically dismantled over the course of 30 years. The rhythmic pounding of the forging presses is returning to Europe a grim symphony of necessity. Consequently, the landscape of European industry is undergoing a seismic transformation. Defense contractors, once viewed with a degree of societal suspicion and subject to strict ethical investment guidelines, have suddenly become the darlings of the financial markets. The stock prices of major European arms manufacturers, such as Rheinmetall in Germany, before anyone else Systems in the United Kingdom, and Thales in France, have surged to unprecedented historic highs. Order books that were previously stagnant are now overflowing with multi-billion euro contracts extending deep into the next decade. New factories are breaking ground across the continent at a pace not seen since the height of the Cold War. In small industrial towns, the dormant chimneys are smoking once again, and recruitment drives are actively seeking thousands of engineers, welders, and software developers. The military-industrial complex is no longer a dirty word. It is openly championed by politicians as the fundamental bedrock of national survival. This economic boom, however, is deeply paradoxical. It is a tremendous surge in industrial activity and technological innovation, yet it is entirely driven by the profound failure of international diplomacy and the terrifying resurgence of kinetic warfare. It is an economy fueled by tragedy. To understand the scale of this industrial resurgence, one need only look at the titans of European defense manufacturing. Companies like Germany's Rheinmetall and the United Kingdom's Before Anyone Else Systems have transformed from specialized contractors into the absolute vanguard of European security. Rheinmetall, historically known for forging the lethal smoothbore guns of the Leopard 2 tank, is experiencing an unprecedented expansion. It is rapidly constructing new ammunition plants across Europe, aiming to multiply its production capacity of 155mm shells by an order of magnitude. The company's stock valuation has skyrocketed, reflecting its central role in the continent's rearmament strategy. Similarly, Before Anyone Else Systems is running its shipyards and aerospace facilities at maximum capacity, accelerating the production of complex systems ranging from nuclear-powered attack submarines to advanced electronic warfare suites. These corporations are no longer merely fulfilling government contracts. They are actively shaping national security policy, advising governments on procurement strategies and technological investments. The executives of these defense giants walk the corridors of power with a newly found, undeniable influence. This immense concentration of industrial power underscores a grim reality. The survival of the European democratic project is now inextricably linked to the profit margins and production quotas of its armaments manufacturers. This resurgence is not merely a quantitative return to the past, it is a qualitative leap into a terrifying new era of warfare. The European rearmament effort is occurring simultaneously with a rapid, unprecedented technological revolution on the battlefield. The mass production of traditional artillery and armor is now running parallel to a frantic arms race in autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, and electronic warfare. The skies above modern battlefields are saturated with cheap, lethally effective drones, fundamentally altering the calculus of armored maneuvers and infantry tactics. European defense initiatives are pouring billions into developing counter-drone technologies, advanced loitering munitions, and next-generation fighter systems like the Future Combat Air System. The integration of artificial intelligence into targeting algorithms and battlefield management systems is transforming the very nature of command and control. We are witnessing the fusion of 20th century industrial mass with 21st century algorithmic precision. This hybrid warfare requires a defense industry that is not only capable of pouring thousands of tons of steel, but also writing millions of lines of sophisticated code. The arsenals of Europe are being rebuilt, but the weapons they forge are evolving into something entirely unprecedented and profoundly lethal. Geographically, the epicenter of this militarization has shifted decisively towards the east. The nations bordering the Russian Federation, Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland are not merely increasing their defense budgets, they are fundamentally restructuring their societies for total defense. Poland, driven by deeply ingrained historical trauma and a clear-eyed assessment of the current threat, is on a trajectory to build the most formidable conventional land army in Europe. Warsaw is executing staggering procurement contracts, purchasing hundreds of main battle tanks, self-propelled howitzers, and rocket artillery systems from both the United States and South Korea. The concept of the Baltic Wall is no longer a metaphorical boundary, but a physical reality being constructed with concrete anti-tank obstacles and dense minefields along the eastern frontiers. Finland's historic accession to NATO has added hundreds of miles to the alliance's direct border with Russia, bringing with it a highly capable military backed by one of the most comprehensive civil defense systems in the world. The center of gravity of European security has moved away from the comfortable capitals of the West to the anxious, heavily armed borders of the East, where the memory of occupation remains a living, breathing reality. The most visible physical manifestation of this new era of confrontation is the construction of what is effectively a modern Baltic Wall. The nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, acutely aware of their geographical vulnerability and historical trauma, are undertaking a monumental engineering effort to fortify their eastern borders. This is not a metaphorical political barrier. It is a physical network of deeply entrenched defenses designed to halt a mechanized invasion. The Baltic Defence Line involves the construction of hundreds of reinforced concrete bunkers, carefully positioned to interlock fields of fire across critical approach routes. Vast depots of anti-tank mines, razor wire, and pre-positioned explosive charges are being established to rapidly create impassable kill zones. Natural obstacles, such as dense forests and marshlands, are being integrated into the defensive architecture. This staggering infrastructure project represents a total abandonment of the post-Cold War philosophy of borderless security. It is a stark, concrete acknowledgement that diplomacy has failed, and that the only reliable deterrent against a hostile neighbor is the undeniable physical capability to inflict catastrophic losses upon an advancing army. The scars of the 20th century are being violently carved back into the landscape of the 21st. The financial implications of this monumental shift are staggering and will inevitably reshape the social fabric of the European continent. For decades, the generous social welfare state models of Western Europe were implicitly subsidized by the peace dividend. The funds not spent on tanks and fighter jets were invested in universal healthcare, expansive pensions, and robust infrastructure. Now, as governments commit to sustaining defense budgets at or well above the 2% NATO threshold, a brutal economic reality is setting in. The era of cheap security is over. Financing this colossal rearmament will require difficult, deeply unpopular political choices. It means diverting vast sums of public capital away from domestic priorities and towards the voracious appetite of the military-industrial complex. It may require increased taxation, taking on significant national debt, or severe cuts to social programs. The political consensus required to sustain this level of military spending over the long term, especially during periods of economic stagnation and inflation, will be severely tested. The tragic irony is that to defend the European way of life, European nations may be forced to fundamentally compromise the very social safety nets that define their post-war prosperity. Beyond the economic calculus, Europe is undergoing a profound psychological and societal militarization. The concept of conscription, long abolished and viewed as an archaic infringement on personal liberty in most Western European nations, is suddenly returning to the mainstream political discourse. Several countries have already reintroduced or expanded mandatory military service, recognizing that high-intensity warfare requires a deep pool of trained reserves. Civil defense initiatives, once the punchline of Cold War nostalgia, are being rapidly revived. Citizens are being issued guidelines on stockpiling emergency supplies, locating bomb shelters, and preparing for prolonged disruptions to critical infrastructure. The psychological distancing from the realities of war, a luxury enjoyed for over 30 years, is collapsing. The cultural narrative is shifting from a celebration of borderless pacifism to a grim acknowledgement of national resilience and martial duty. It is a sobering transformation. To watch a continent that so deeply prided itself on having transcended the brutal logic of hard power be forced back into the rigid, disciplined mindset of a garrison state is to witness one of the most profound historical regressions of our time. The shadow of the barracks has returned to the public square. Looming over this entire conventional rearmament effort is the terrifying, inescapable shadow of nuclear deterrence. The resurgence of high-intensity conflict on the continent has brutally reminded Europe that the ultimate guarantor of sovereignty remains the atomic arsenal. While Britain and France maintain their independent nuclear deterrence, the vast majority of Europe relies entirely on the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States. This dependency is now the subject of intense, anxious scrutiny. The shifting political tides across the Atlantic have forced European strategists to confront the nightmare scenario. What if the American security guarantee is compromised or withdrawn? This existential dread is driving whispered, highly controversial conversations about the necessity of a unified, sovereign European nuclear deterrent. The fact that such concepts previously dismissed as fringe, destabilizing paranoia are now being seriously debated in the corridors of power underscores the sheer desperation of the current strategic environment. The nuclear tripwires, long forgotten by the general public, are being inspected and tightened. The ultimate tragedy of the nuclear age is that the only perceived defense against annihilation is the credible threat of inflicting it in return. This frantic rearmament is not occurring in a vacuum. It is the catalyst for a massive tectonic geopolitical realignment. The architecture of European security, carefully constructed over decades through complex treaties and diplomatic forums, has effectively collapsed. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is largely paralyzed. The web of arms control agreements that defined the late Cold War has been systematically dismantled. We are witnessing the descent of a new, harder, and far more volatile Iron Curtain. On one side, a heavily militarized, deeply integrated NATO alliance, expanding its borders and dramatically increasing its lethality. On the other, a heavily sanctioned, revanchist power, increasingly reliant on a wartime economy and deepening alliances with other autocratic states. The diplomatic off-ramps have been closed, the bridges of economic interdependence have been burned. Europe is locking itself into a posture of long-term structural confrontation. The tragedy of this realignment is its stark inevitability. The failure of the post-Cold War security architecture left a vacuum that is now being filled by the raw, unyielding physics of military containment. The continent is settling into a long, bitter twilight struggle. As a historian, it is impossible to observe this massive continental mobilization without a profound sense of sorrow. We are caught in the relentless, tragic cycle of human history. The pattern is tragically familiar. A catastrophic conflict leads to a period of exhaustion and a desperate desire for perpetual peace. The arsenals are dismantled, the military is neglected, and the belief takes hold that human nature has somehow evolved beyond the necessity of war. But the fundamental drivers of conflict, fear, pride, and the competition for power remain dormant, not eradicated. Eventually, a crisis exposes the weakness, the illusion shatters, and the frantic, costly race to rearm begins anew. Europe is currently experiencing the violent whiplash of this cycle. We are paying the exorbitant price of our own complacency. The billions of euros now pouring into artillery factories and drone development are the brutal tax levied upon a society that chose to forget the lessons of its own blood-soaked past. We are rebuilding the very machines of destruction that our grandfathers swore would never again be unleashed upon this continent. It is a necessary endeavor for survival, but it is undeniably a tragic admission of our collective failure. Ultimately, the tragedy of Europe's return to arms is not just in the colossal financial cost or the stark geopolitical risks, it is in the profound philosophical defeat it represents. We dare to dream of a continent where the logic of power was replaced by the rule of law, where borders were lines on a map rather than fortified trenches, and where the military-industrial complex would slowly rust into obsolescence. That dream has proven to be an illusion, shattered by the brutal realities of the 21st century. As the factory floors of Rheinmetall and before anyone else systems roar back to life, and as young Europeans once again contemplate the prospect of conscription, we are forced to confront a dark, unyielding truth. The peace we enjoyed was an anomaly, an artificial pause in the long, violent continuum of history. We are not entering a new, enlightened era. We are simply turning back the clock, returning to the grim, necessary work of deterrence and defense. The cycle of tragedy is complete. Europe has awakened from its beautiful slumber, only to find itself back exactly where it started, standing in the shadow of the forge, preparing once again for the possibility of war.